Hello, and welcome again to our reviewing of the upcoming scripture readings. On this, the Solemnity of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of the universe. So it is the last Sunday now of what we call the liturgical year, and more popularly known as the Feast of Christ the King. As you will remember, this particular feast was introduced into the church by Pope Pius XI back in 1925 because he was very concerned at that time about the destructive forces that were in the world at the time. The First World War had ended, the Second World War had not begun, but there were many disturbances which were already beginning in Europe and which caused the attention of Rome to be concerned. So the thought was to remember Jesus as certainly the Lord and the King of all. Now, the date chosen, 1925, happened to be the 16th century anniversary of the first council of the church, the Council of Nicaea, at which the divinity of Jesus and the humanity of Jesus had been reaffirmed. And the argument at the council had been the unity of Christ with the fathers. Now, traditionally, this feast was observed on the last Sunday of October, which preceded the celebration of the feasts of all saints and all souls. And so that was the kind of triad that was observed originally, but this was later changed to now the last Sunday of the liturgical year, and that would be this coming weekend. So all of that's a little bit of a background to the observance of the Feast of Christ the King. The use of the imagery of king, of course, does not sit particularly relevant with the American society, where we, of course, are much more accustomed to being a republic, where we choose our leadership and where there is a changing with some regularity of the leadership. For us as Christians, Christ is always the King, and that would not be something we believe that would change. The readings for this week first come from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, from the book of Revelation, the opening part of that work, so chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, and the gospel comes from the gospel according to John, chapter 18, verses 33b through 37. The reason, of course, and we will look at this a little bit in detail today, we have noticed that throughout the Markan year, when we need what we would call fillers for Mark's story, because it wasn't long enough, that we often refer to the Gospel of John. And so it's appropriate that in looking at a way of appreciating Jesus' kingship, we go to John, and we go now to his passion narrative. Now, the passion narrative of John is read, you remember, on Good Friday. It is traditionally the gospel passage, the whole, that is used on that occasion. But today we're going to look at one little section of John's gospel, and this has to do with the dialogue that takes place between Jesus and Pilate. So now, again, we're just going to examine a little bit this particular section. It's part of a larger whole and a larger portrait of Jesus that is presented by the Johannine Gospel. And remembering also that the development of Johannine doctrine and thinking was the latter part of the first century, maybe even the early part of the second century. So it's a little later development of thinking. The picture here is that Jesus is led now from Caiaphas, where a kind of gathering had taken place, and the leaders, the Jewish leaders of Jerusalem, bring Jesus to Pilate. Now, one of the kind of neat structure of this little particular section of John's Gospel is that it unfolds with 7 little venues, okay? So 7 little scenes. And the playoff is between outside, inside, outside, in the middle, inside, outside, outside, okay? So the author has kind of nicely rearranged things. So it begins as the leadership is bringing Jesus now to Pilate, that they somehow communicate to Pilate, or in John's Gospel he already knows this, goes out to meet them. So this is the first episode here, to meet the leaders who have brought Jesus to him, and they say this man deserves to be crucified. And Pilate says to them, well, if you think so, go do it yourself, okay? And they say to him, but no, we can't do this because we are prohibited by Roman practice and Roman law to do this. So they seek his death, but they are unable to do it. This, therefore, finds Pilate going inside the praetorium, and Jesus is brought before him. And this is now where the episode that we're going to hear this week. Now, so this is the second of 7 parts. We'll look at this just very quickly at the end to see how this whole little section involves Pilate and Jesus. So it's an interesting dialogue that takes place. Keep in mind, as we said, this takes place many years after Jesus' time, and secondly, who would have been witness to this dialogue? So clearly this is Johannine thinking that is being presented for our consideration. Pilate says to Jesus, or asks him really, are you the king of the Jews? Because that would be one of the few reasons that Pilate would have any interest in examining Jesus. Anyone who set himself up in opposition to Rome by calling himself a Jew, a king rather. So the question, and by the way, just as an aside, the idea of king had different meanings to the Jews than it did to Rome. To the Jews, it somehow meant that a man who was considered to be king would be also recognized as the Messiah, as the one sent by God. For the Romans, someone who claimed to be king was in opposition to the authority of Rome. And that was the understanding that was well developed by the other 3 gospel writers, known as the synoptics, that in some ways Jesus posed a threat to Rome. Well, here that really isn't the issue. Many of the Jews were not so ready to accept Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ. So all of this is the background to Pilate's question as it's presented, are you the king of the Jews? Now Jesus gets a little quippy here, almost a little cynical. Are you saying this because you want to know the answer, or has somebody else told you this title? So as the dialogue between Pilate and Jesus unfolds, it's interesting to notice that in some ways Jesus always has the upper hand. He always has kind of the leadership of the question. Well, says Pilate, look, it's not me that's thinking this way, but those who have handed you over to me. So rather than giving a yes or no, Jesus really says to Pilate, are you personally interested in answering this, or are you simply repeating what a group has told you? So this now sets the dialogue in a little different perspective, and Pilate now goes outside. So this is the episode, remember, inside, outside. Goes outside and says to the group outside that I find Jesus innocent, and in fact offers to set him free. They, on the other hand, now say, wait a minute, there's a custom here. We don't want him to go free. Let Barabbas go free. So that's where Barabbas is introduced in the Johannine story. But let's back up a moment to what this dialogue between Jesus and Pilate is all about. The answer here is that Jesus doesn't deny the title of king. And then he says, if it's a question of kingship, if my kingship were to take place here, and my kingship were to replace that of Rome, I would have a whole legion of angels to come and to make sure that that happened. But my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is different. So Pilate now is a little caught off guard. What is this kingdom that Jesus is speaking of? But in assurance to Pilate, he's saying, my kingdom is not a threat to Rome, but rather is something very different and something which would be open not only to those who are in positions of leadership, both in Judaism and Roman authority, but also would be open to everyone. So Jesus, with Pilate, is contrasting his kingdom to the kingdom that others were expecting, and saying it's not of this world, but in doing that, he is indirectly admitting that he is a king. So his kingdom is different, and that's what he would hope his preaching and teaching had been all about, and that even Pilate might be included in this. Well, that doesn't go too far. Pilate is not particularly interested in this kind of dialogue, but even if his kingdom was not a threat to Rome, Jesus goes on to say, look, what I came to do is to teach and to preach the truth. And the truth is that will make people free. Well, this, of course, explains, as Jesus teaches Pilate, or tells Pilate, that my kind of mission in life has been to testify to the truth. Well, as you remember, it ends, although the gospel selection today does not include the final question of Pilate, who says, what is truth? Now, it's important to notice that therefore this summarizes, as Jesus speaks of kingship and being king, that his role has always been to be the emissary of the Father, that although there is a unique relationship that Jesus has with the Father, his mission is to bring the truth. Earlier on in this gospel, Jesus had said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so in that sense, notice that truth here is not as sometimes we might think of it as kind of, well, will you tell the truth, okay? So truth is a kind of fact or absence of a fact if you don't tell the truth. But in this case, when Jesus speaks about the truth, he is in fact speaking of himself. He is the truth of the Father. And therefore, in that way, the idea of the kingship takes on a little different role in understanding Jesus, the titles rather, that are given to Jesus. So Pilate now is pictured, to pick up again, having heard this from Jesus, goes back outside to the group. Now this moves us to chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. Not what we will hear, but just to put this whole little story, a sequence story into perspective. Pilate again says, well, this time he's kind of interesting. And this would be the fourth little section of the 7. Many see it as the centering. Pilate, we're not quite sure where he's standing here. He's not inside, he's not outside. he takes Jesus. Interesting. He pictures Pilate as taking Jesus and scourges him. Now, probably he didn't do it, but his soldiers did it. And then the soldiers crown him with thorns and give him a purple robe. And then Pilate presents Jesus to the group. And they, of course, have, interestingly, mocked him out by saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him with their hands. So there's a kind of irony that John brings into this episode where Jesus' kingship is recognized, but how it is understood and how it is experienced. This then opens a famous scene that perhaps many portraits of Jesus have been presented, where Pilate presents Jesus now with the crown of thorns and the purple and the scourging. "Behold the man." Ecce homo, you probably have seen that. Again, what Pilate seems to be wanting to do, is the gospel presents it, is to win the sympathy of the Jews, that is the leadership, and they will let Jesus go. It does not work. He then, again, is outside with the leadership, claims that Jesus, well, not claims, but states that Jesus is innocent. I find nothing here to render the judgment of death. They claim, "We want him dead." Well, Pilate now, and this would be episode 6 of these 7, goes back into the praetorium, brings Jesus in. We can only imagine that the cloak and the thorns are still on his head, and asks the question of Jesus, "Where did you come from?" This is a common question that is raised throughout this gospel. Now, as listeners to John's gospel, we know where Jesus came from. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Jesus has come from the Father. So we know that, but Pilate and others thought that Jesus, of course, had come from Nazareth. But Pilate is interested. Who is this man? He makes a claim to be kingship, but what is this all about? And Jesus doesn't answer him, and Pilate says to him, "Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you or to let you go?" And Jesus says, "But that power would not have been given to you if it did not come from God." So again, notice the upper handness of Jesus in responding to Pilate. Now, of course, Pilate wants to let him go. Pilate says he's your king to the audience. There's again the title king. The group says, "We have no king but Caesar." So this is an interesting kind of betrayal of Jesus given by the audience. Again, keep in mind, this is the construct of John in presenting this whole episode about the kingship of Jesus, because Pilate pictured somewhat as weak here, not able to resist the threat that if you don't give loyalty to Caesar, then maybe there is something that we could report that would put you in a disfavorable light with the Roman authority. So the episode, finally, Jesus is brought out. Pilate condemns Jesus to death, and John makes at this point that it was the 6th hour. Now, those who are paying attention to this, what's the difference, 6th hour? Well, it was exactly at the 6th hour that in the temple area, the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. So at the time in which the Passover lambs were now being prepared for the Passover, Jesus, who is the Lamb of God, will be condemned and handed over to death. So that's how this particular episode ends. So you can see why it was chosen for our consideration. The concluding words, of course, are important to Pilate, and perhaps words that we live by and hope to live by. Jesus says, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So Jesus is the voice of the Father. Jesus is the voice of truth because he is truth. Jesus is the way and the life for all who accept him. So all of that, I think, is why this particular episode was chosen this week on the feast of Christ the King. On other Sundays of the celebration of Christ the King, other sections of the gospel are chosen. Now, the first reading comes from the book of Daniel. Book of Daniel, we may have mentioned before, and he appears a couple of times, was what we would call an ethereal prophet, A-S-T-R-A-L, I think that's how you say that, in the Israelite tradition. That is, they have, in the experience of a trance, what we would call an altered state of consciousness. Now, all of this is part of what we call apocalyptic thinking. We mentioned something of this last week. The second half of the book of Daniel, nicely, first 6 chapters go one way, the rest of the work go another way, present Daniel as a visionary. And the way in which they figured things out, it's interesting, is that they were able to look at the constellation in the heavens. So they were literally stargazers. And if you go out on a starry night, a clear night, look up into the heavens, you will notice that we notice, or that those who do these things notice certain animals, certain constellations forming certain designs, not always available at every time of the year, but often able to discern. Now, why do I go into this? All of this is to say that one of those constellations appears to create a human shape. And that's where the image of one like the Son of Man appears. So in this case, Son of Man, Son is lowercase son. It looks like a human figure. And if you can, on a starry night, look out, you could see it. And many were quite familiar with this in the ancient Mediterranean world. As I said, other figures represented animals or beasts, and you still find this, those who do these kind of things. The beasts generally represented pagan kingdoms. The human figure seemed to represent a theocratic kingdom, or a kingdom that had something to do with God. So Daniel, in his visions, will say that there will eventually appear a monarch, a son of man. And in the book of Daniel, it seems that the reference here is to saintly people of Israel. So the term Son of Man has a conglomerate meaning rather than an individual meaning, a collectiveness, okay? And that this kind of grouping will be the source of revelation. This will be the source of salvation. Now, we're not sure whether or not by the time of the Christian era, that would be the first century world, that some shifting of thinking with regard to the Son of Man may have been created so that some were expecting a messianic king. So whoever the Son of Man is, has moved now from being a collective person to an individual person. It's interesting that in our Sunday lectionaries, Son of Man now becomes capital S, capital S. It's not really true in the New American Bible, which still keeps it small. Now, why do I mention all this? Because you notice that as soon as you have made the S capital, it makes a nice reference to Jesus. And that, of course, is the purpose for this little section coming from Daniel's book. Visions were often given in dreams, and all of this is part of apocalyptic thinking, apocalyptic way of doing things. The fact that the Son of Man will ride on the clouds. Well, clouds always represent some presence of God, or even riding on the clouds reminds one of riding a chariot, that somehow in the heavens, the things that go on earth are going on up there. So, and also the Son of Man receives his power from the Ancient One. So the Ancient One is generally recognized as being God, who gives, therefore, the Son of Man the power and authority that he has. So this dominion is granted by God and is not attained by means of conquest or political alliance. So it's important to see that the Son of Man in this new kingdom is something who comes graced and gifted by God, not by conflict or ability on the part of the Son of Man to achieve this title. So all of this may explain a little bit why this particular section of Daniel's book is used. Finally, the book of Revelation, which is the second reading, again, apocalyptic reading, pictured opening in the first 3 chapters as sending letters to 7 churches at the time. But the words that we'll hear this week, are the features of a traditional letter. So whether or not Revelation should be considered a letter, but it does take on a lot of different characteristics. And here we hear a greeting and thanksgiving, which is directed to God. Now, why it is chosen is because clearly here Jesus is seen as the Messiah, as the Anointed One, and given some interesting titles. The firstborn of the dead, the first ruler of the earth. So a priority certainly is given to Jesus, and as ruler of the earth, or other translations would say, ruler of all the kings of the world. So again, kingship can make, without too much effort, the connection here that takes place. We are reminded in this opening word what God has done in the past, that God has loved us, freed us from sins by his blood. So here is an allusion again to Jesus, and makes us into a kingdom of priests for his God and Father. So when Jesus, and it has great apocalyptic thought, doesn't it, comes riding on the clouds. So a lot of this is beautiful imagery, poetry, literary value. And the title of Jesus that we have heard and that is often used, for example, on the occasion of the Easter Vigil, when the candle is very important, is blessed, Jesus is pictured as the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. Alpha, of course, is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last. Now, whether everybody really appreciated that, one doesn't know. So, again, some very beautiful titles for Jesus. If sometime you read through the book of Revelation, you will find that there are a number of other titles which are given to Jesus in this book. But for this week, again, Feast of Christ the King. King, as I mentioned, is probably not immediately something that intrigues us, although I always have to smile on how we pay a lot of attention to kings and queens who are not part of our country. What happens to the Queen of England, and what happens to the Queen of other places, of Scotland, etc. So although we claim not to like royalty, we do. But in our royalty is certainly to Jesus, and it's a fitting feast to conclude the liturgical year, grateful for all we have learned, particularly from the Gospel of Mark, and now with his companion, John, as we bring to an end this year. So once again, thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.